Today on the planning period, we're talking poetry, and whether you teach science, social studies, ELA, theater, or you just want to spark some interesting classroom discussions, or you want to get students speaking and performing, or you want students to bring an ancient art form to life using technology and media, the possibilities are endless. Let's jump right in with some of my favorite poetry content that we have from our new show, Read, Write, Roar, for upper elementary learners. Now, before I lose you, if that's not your grade level, that's okay, because what I'm going to show you is a couple videos that just do a fantastic job of explaining different poetic forms in a way that anyone can understand, including fourth graders. But I think middle schoolers and high schoolers would have a blast with this content and these activities too. So Jeff Cass is a high school teacher at Pioneer High School in Ann Arbor, and he helped us to create the poetry segments in the show. In one of the segments about writing haiku, Mr. Cass helps us understand that there are some guidelines for writing a haiku.
The essence of a haiku is to capture a small moment with an image that appeals to the five senses. The image is then presented to the reader as a kind of, a gift, with the hope the reader will then experience a feeling similar to what the writer felt when they wrote it. William J. Higginson, author of the Haiku Handbook, calls haiku a touchstone of suggestiveness. What he means by that is haiku describes a moment, but how the moment feels is not described. How it feels is up to the reader. It's true haiku are short, and they're usually, but not always, 3 lines. They often explore nature, but specifically what they explore is the intersection between humankind and the natural world. That's why they're a good way to examine the idea of urban sprawl, which is the intersection of human-built cities and the natural world.
But more importantly, there's a vibe to what makes a haiku, and I love that the practice we see in the clip is about the environment. Haiku have always been about natural beauty and capturing moments in time, and in the Read, Write, Roar series, Mr. Cass helps us conceptualize the role of haiku in bearing witness to urban sprawl and the paradox of technology and waste and architecture as a foreground to the beauty of nature. Now that's some heavy stuff, but the brilliance of this segment is that haiku isn't a particularly heavy lift for a poet. It's 3 lines, there's some structure, but as Mr. Cass shares, it's not super strict, and you can modify the entry point in terms of what you ask your students to write about. Urban sprawl is a pretty high-level concept that 12th graders could really dig into, but 4th graders could also totally understand what Mr. Cass explains in the video. I'm gonna spend more time on the haiku in a later segment, but I do have to shout out the rest of Mr. Cass's segments in the show where he teaches us about odes and found poetry and a few other poetic forms that are engaging and accessible for a variety of learners and can easily be integrated into different subject areas and contexts for interdisciplinary learning. Leave a comment if you want to see me talk more about any of these. But anyway, I tried writing a haiku, and I also asked all of my friends on the MLC team across the state to share some of theirs. And here's what we came up with. We are all unique. Meet our new friend, the raccoon, Carl the Collector. That one came from Jenny, education director at Detroit PBS. Marcy, early education specialist from WGVU, also wrote about Carl. A raccoon named Carl, collecting and connecting friendships and fun times. And Kara, our resident media literacy expert, shared one inspired by spring and her garden. Buzzing from flower to flower, drenched in gold dust, helping the earth live. I wrote one, but I'm gonna share it in a minute because I wanna up the ante a little. Let's make this a media challenge. Now, if you want to fill up a week of instructional time with a high-interest activity connected to Poetry Month, creative writing, place-based learning, student voice and choice, fine arts, and technology and media, it's time to make haiku videos. Day 1, introduce the haiku. Use the clip from Read, Write, Roar for an accessible, low-stakes intro to the poetic form with a built-in opportunity for some initial writing and have students produce their first haiku or series of haiku. Mr. Cass will help you frame the writing prompt in a low-stakes, disarming way for your students, and they'll be primed for more. Day 2, build context. It's going to be important for the media challenge that students understand the history of haiku in Japan, and how this poetry was never really meant to be just text. Haiku were historically paired with paintings or sketches to tell a whole immersive story. Now this is where I think it gets fun. Ask your students, where do we see immersive art or media today that incorporates visuals and text? They may not get there right away, but hopefully after some thoughtful and interesting discussion, your students will arrive at the realization that haiku are kind of an old form of social media posts. Today, everything that we see is a mixture of visual and text, and sure, a lot of it is not what we would consider artistic, but a lot of people put a lot of energy into making aesthetic reels or really poetic posts that use multimedia to communicate a feeling. Day 3, issue the prompt. Now students know what haiku is, they get the history and context of this very minimal yet impactful art form, and they've started to make connections to how digital media can function in a similar way. So you get to decide as the teacher what parameters you want to give them when they write their own haiku. You can ask them to incorporate some course material or a concept you've been working on. You can keep it traditional and ask them to write about nature. The sky's the limit. But the media challenge comes when you have them not only write the poem on paper, but add layers of visual and audio to create an immersive multimedia poem and a modern version of traditional haiku. April is Poetry Month, but back in March, there was a really cool event in Lansing that brought together educators, young people, and poets from all around the state Poetry Out Loud Finals. Poetry Out Loud is a national poetry recitation program that supports the teaching of poetry in classrooms across the country, guiding students to read and analyze poetry from a variety of eras and genres, with the eventual goal of choosing poems to memorize and recite. We've got some longer segments on the site where you can learn more about the program and the championship competition from the past couple of years if you're interested. I had the opportunity to integrate Poetry Out Loud into my teaching when I was an ELA teacher, and I loved it. We had a lot of fun reading and memorizing older poems, which otherwise are hard to interpret and not always super fun or engaging, but the parameters of the contest sort of required that students just get into it. And the theater of recitation provided another point of entry for students who didn't necessarily care to read the poem, but were motivated by delivering an impactful, dramatic, comedic, or even ironic performance on stage. But anyway, my goal here today is not necessarily to pitch Poetry Out Loud to you, but just to talk about the benefits of incorporating some version of memorization and recitation into your poetry teaching and learning. I think, especially in recent years, memorization as an activity in classrooms has gotten a bad rap, and in many cases rightfully so. Asking students to memorize facts, dates, and definitions doesn't usually impact long-term retention or skill development. It's not a valuable practice for the kinds of learning that students need to be doing in 2025. But at the same time, there has been research to support memorization in the context of poetry recitation. If you're like me, poetry has always sort of been a bear to figure out how to teach, and it's a challenge to engage students. Poetry has this reputation of being inaccessible, elitist, and unnecessarily obtuse. But with other forms of project-based learning, when students have an additional real learning goal that they can tap into, sometimes those initial barriers can come down. So the antics of reciting a poem that's over 200 years old and uses weird, antiquated language and might otherwise be super inaccessible becomes at least curious, and in some cases maybe even fun and energizing. Now, of course, recitation doesn't have to rely on old poems, and it doesn't have to be about bringing otherwise challenging language to life in outrageous ways. Students might also feel empowered by reciting modern poetry. They might be interested in delivering hip-hop bars or slam poetry, and there are tons of examples of this kind of writing and performance online. Again, the research indicates that this type of memorization, which relies on connection, interpretation, perspective taking, can empower students to think critically, use language more creatively and expressively, and even grow their ability to be hopeful and envision the world around them differently. Plus, you're giving them an opportunity to be over the top and unnecessarily dramatic, so you're also tapping into the power of imaginative play and theater, which have been proven to have a positive impact on learning, retention, and comfort and empowerment in the classroom. If you're looking for video-based poetry content with engaging lessons to bring into your classroom this month, I have some great recommendations. First up, The Power of Poetry from the Michigan Learning Channel. This 1-hour special takes a look at examples of poetry from around our state and how people use poetry to express themselves and teach and learn. And along the way, we have a very special guest teacher from Inside Out Arts in Detroit who leads us through some poetry reading and writing. This program is available for free on our site, and you can find the full video and all of the accompanying materials at the link in the description. Next, last year we were able to create another 30-minute poetry special as part of season 5 of our middle school level show Extra Credit. This special episode is one of my favorites because it's youth-led and it takes a deep look at places around our state where young people interact with poetry, from a poetry and art mural project in Flint to a youth-led poetry laureate program in Ypsilanti and more. I would bring it into my classroom as an example of the power of poetry and what we might do with poetry in our community. I would invite students to discuss what they see and maybe even think about what would be relevant for bringing poetry into our school or larger community. Finally, a PBS program that's been running for a while but is always fun to take a look at, Poetry in America, brings celebrities and other influential people on screen to talk about their favorite poems and how poetry has impacted their lives and their work. I love this program because I think it can inspire all of us to consider the impact of poetry, especially in ways we might not necessarily think about. And I think this one in particular would make a fantastic media challenge. I would challenge my students to identify people in our community and set up interviews where they talk about what poetry means to them, what their favorite poems are, and maybe even recite a few lines on camera. This would make an amazing set of videos that any community would be proud to have, and I'd love if you do this and share it with us, and I'm sure your local library would love to have access to these stories as well. So that's today's episode. I hope you're feeling inspired, maybe a little poetic, and ready to bring your students closer together and also empower them to share more of themselves with us all. If you found anything in this episode useful, please let us know by leaving a comment or sending me an email. As always, I'd love to connect and help double the impact you're already having in your classroom. And because why not? I'm gonna leave you today with a haiku. Thanks to all of you across the best state, Michigan, for learning with me.
This program is made possible in part by the state of Michigan and by viewers like you. Thank you.